Welcome everybody to the 7th Annual Massachusetts Open Space Conference. The goal of this conference is to provide resources, networking, and peer-to-peer learning opportunities for members of open space committees, as well as anyone that is interested or involved in local conservation and the protection of open space. We're thrilled that you all are able to join us today for our Week 1 webinar, The Ecological Context of Your Community. This event is an effort of the Conservation-Based Planning Outreach Initiative, which is organized in partnership with the University of Massachusetts Amherst and Mount Graceland Conservation Trust. This is also funded through the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation's Working Forest Initiative. I'd like to take a quick moment to thank everyone that helped in planning this year's Open Space Conference. The University of Massachusetts Amherst, Mount Graceland Conservation Trust, the North Quabbin Regional Landscape Partnership, Green Cambridge, and lastly, the Emerald Necklace Conservancy. I also want to take a moment to share a new free resource with you all, the Open Space Handbook. This resource is written from a community volunteer perspective, and it covers a variety of topics, such as planning your community's open space, land protection tools, stewardship, and funding. It also contains a number of case studies in it, including one on writing an open space and recreation plan. So be sure to check that out. In addition to the Open Space Conference, the Open Space Network is also offering additional upcoming events. This includes an introductory mass mapper training, which is a free online mapping tool which recently replaced Oliver. If you'd like to learn more about these events, as well as view the Open Space Handbook, you can do so by visiting the Mass Open Space website. I have just a couple of quick housekeeping notes to share with you all. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing after the webinar today. We'll also have a Q&A segment after all of our presentations where you will have the opportunity to ask our speakers questions. During the Q&A, please feel free to use the raise hand function to ask a question out loud, or you can type it into the chat either during the Q&A or at any point of today's webinar. We'll also have a short evaluation at the end of the webinar that we encourage everyone to fill out, as we greatly appreciate your input on today's events. Lastly, resources from today will be available for viewing on the Mass Open Space website. This is a first in a series of 4 weekly webinars and networking sessions that are designed to help you think about how your community fits within larger contexts: ecological, social, climate, and financial. Today is the ecological context. For this webinar, we are joined by 3 fantastic speakers. Paul Catanzaro is an associate professor and state extension forester at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He is also the co-director of the Family Forest Research Center. Paul's research and outreach work focuses on understanding and informing family forest owner decisions about the intergenerational transfer of their land and forest resiliency. Today, Paul will be discussing the vital role that open space committees have and other local volunteers have in the protection of open space, as well as sharing some tips and tools for thinking about natural resources. Melissa Cryan is the Grants Program Supervisor at the Division of Conservation Services. She reviews municipal open space and recreation plans and also administers the Park, Land and Water Conservation Fund, and Conservation Partnership grant programs. Today, Melissa will be sharing pointers for writing an open space and recreation plan, which is an important tool in open space planning that also can help you gain a better understanding of the ecological components that are present in your community. Lastly, Cynthia Henshaw is the Executive Director of the East Quabbin Land Trust, with a strong interest in supporting landowners and local communities in conserving and caring for their lands. Over the past 25 years, she's had the opportunity to participate with community members in open space and recreation plan updates, and then successfully conserving priority properties in several of the East Quabbin region towns. Today, Cynthia will be discussing how the East Quabbin Land Trust is working to protect resources and engage the Ware River neighborhood through the Neighborhood Outreach Grant. So I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker today, Paul Catanzaro. Please feel free to take it away, Paul.
Hey, good afternoon, friends. I have something embarrassing to admit. I was really excited, or I am very excited about this conference and today's webinar. And I may have put a few too many slides in the presentation because there was so much I wanted to talk about and talk with you about. So I'm going to dive right into it. And I would encourage you to write down any questions you have. As Julia said, we have time for questions afterwards. So I'm just going to dive right into it here. That's not diving right in. There we go. All right. So talking about ecological context. And as soon as we hear those words, oftentimes this is the kind of map that we think about. And we are going to get to this map of ecologically important areas that we might prioritize for land protection. And so this happens to be a map of interior forests out in Western Massachusetts. The reason I pull it up is because although a lot of us immediately jump to this point in the conversation of ecological context, I want to overlay something here and show you what those same important ecological resources look like when you overlay a parcel map. The point being that the ecological resources that we seek to try to conserve and the values that we're trying to perpetuate are largely owned by many, many family forest owners and private landowners across the entire state. In fact, their parcels fit together like a jigsaw puzzle almost, and the natural resources, whether it be streams or wildlife habitat or recreational trails, the carbon sequestration and storage that we seek to protect, all of those wonderful benefits are not bounded by those property boundaries, of course. However, the decision-making unit that is making the decisions on what will happen with that land are these private landowners. And so one of the things I wanted to do today is just help frame where you, as an open space committee member or member of a volunteer land trust or interested citizen, I saw in the chat there were a lot of people that look like from trails committees and things, which is fantastic. So what is the conservation landscape look like, and how do you fit in, and why are you so important? So I just wanted to sketch out, at least from my perspective, how it lays out. Of course, we know that there are a lot of wonderful, great statewide land trusts across Massachusetts, the trustees, Mass Audubon, NEF, the Nature Conservancy, and we have state agencies as well that, of course, do land conservation. So Mass Wildlife and DCR are the two great examples. Oh, and MDAR, protecting land for agricultural resources. So we have this sort of statewide group looking across the state. We have a number of wonderful regional land trusts that might work up in, say, the Berkshires or down on the Cape or on the North Shore or in central, like North Quabbin area. So we have these regional land trusts that operate in clusters of towns. And then, of course, we have local land trusts that might be all volunteer members, open space committees, trail committees, community members. And as we think about the importance of private landowners and their decisions, the closer you get to those landowners, the greater the relationships are, and the possibility and the role that you play. The other group I wanted to mention are regional conservation partnerships. These are groups, these are organizations that seek to help to weave or knit together these various groups in particular regions. So there are regional conservation partnerships across the state that try to work, crosswise and knit these groups together. And I'll show a map of where these are located later. What I do want to point out with this slide, however, is there's sort of this general trend that the larger the organization, in general, the greater the capacity, the greater the expertise. And as you move closer to those landowners, the greater the local knowledge, the greater, stronger those local relationships are. And that's a really important point that I want to underscore is your unique role within this landscape, within this conservation landscape, if you will, to do both proactive and reactive land conservation. And by proactive, I mean, and we're going to talk about this, how do you what are some of the tools and the ways to think about prioritizing land in your community, and then, hopefully reaching out to those landowners and priority parcels and working with them. But you also play a very unique and important role in the reactive types of conservation, where you are the ears on the ground, that when a family is about to make a decision about a piece of land or their future and what's going to happen to it. And so you play this essential role within that larger conservation landscape of organizations and agencies, of being that trusted friend and neighbor, of being the first responder, knowing when an opportunity is gonna arise. Oftentimes, you're the community leaders that people look to for some information. They might say, "Oh gosh, I don't know, I heard about this thing called a CR. What the heck is it? Or what are these land trusts, and what do they do? Should I trust them?" So you often end up playing this really pivotal role with these decisions, helping to either connect people, give them some information, give them a contact, convene meetings, be a supporter, say a town meeting, or otherwise just talking to your neighbors about the value of land protection or a particular deal that's happening in your town. And this is a role. And when I work with open space committees and community members across the state, sometimes I get the feeling they feel like, well, we don't have the money. Well, my town, I don't know if they would support that. Or I don't know the tax law, around land conservation, so I feel like I can't talk to a landowner. And I want to dispel that myth. There's no one else in that landscape of conservation organizations and people that can play this role, this unique, essential role, like you can, because you are in the community. You are friends and neighbors with landowners. You are a trusted source. And so that's why I was so excited about today's webinar. So that just sort of sets up a little bit about, the importance of your role in the context within which, land conservation sort of your role fits. Transitioning to more of the ecological piece. Here are some just very common, broad goals that many state agencies and conservation agencies and land trusts and conservation organizations have. These are sort of the essential and some of the main reasons why we seek to protect land. And it's important to recognize that different land trusts and different state agencies have different missions. Department of Ag Resources mission is different than Mass Wildlife. New England Forestry Foundation's mission is different than Mass Audubon's. So, different organizations might, they use land protection as a way to achieve these missions, though, they might specialize or focus on some of these different values and different combinations. But ultimately, together we're all trying to conserve these general conservation goals. And likewise, your community has individual or sort of tailored goals as well, and we'll talk about that in a slide or two. So just to like, what is the ecological context? Well, the ecological context is that we have, a lot of forest cover in Massachusetts. So anything you see that is green, the browns are shrubby areas, and there's some hay fields in there and so forth. So we've got a lot of green out there. That's really good news. The red are developed areas, but we've got a lot of natural resources out on the landscape. And this is why this is, your role is so pivotal. This is work done by Mass Audubon and their losing ground analysis, which is so helpful to so many organizations and people when they do it. But this is sort of the rate of development. And you probably could have guessed there's this gradient from east to west where, maybe a third, maybe even up to half the state is in this sort of rapidly developing sort of the edge of development here. And that development edge keeps pushing out further and further west. And so this is why, the work we do is so timely and so important. Ecologically, when we look to protect those wonderful values that we talked about a few slides ago, recognize that Massachusetts, for being such a small state, is an ecologically very rich state. We have even though we're small, we have no less than whatever that is, 8 or 9 ecoregions within the state. What's an ecoregion? So an ecoregion would be sort of a distinct region of similar similar physiography, similar assemblages of plants and animals that are sort of unique and distinct. And so we've got, even though it's a small state, we've got, 9 of these different ecoregions across our state. Um, as I mentioned, most of our state, almost 2/3 of it is forested. That's the dominant, natural vegetation type. Our land most of our land wants to grow back into forest. And similar to the ecoregion diversity, as you might guess, that it sort of maps to forest type diversity. So we actually have, 5 different unique forest types in Massachusetts. We sit in this really interesting position of still getting, some southern species, but also, we're at a point in the landscape where we're still picking up some spruce fir, some of that green that you associate with northern types of climates. And of course, we have these globally rare and threatened ecosystems down on the Cape, these pitch pine scrub oak communities. So we've got a lot of great resources, very diverse for the size of our state. And just as different individual conservation organizations and agencies have their own set of goals and missions that they're achieving, so too does your community have its own unique set of goals. And so part of this entire process is sort of figuring out what are your natural resources, what are sort of the important parts of your community, sort of what role does it play in those ecoregions? Does it support some of those pitch pine scrub oaks communities, or does it support some wonderful wetland habitat? But what are some of the unique combination of natural resources you have? And then how can land conservation actually help to protect those and meet your community's needs, both ecologically, but also socially and maybe even financially as well. When we consider context and we're talking about the town level, I guess I would just encourage you to consider, the landscape context your town is in, and it's, and I was just guilty of it a few slides ago. It looks like Massachusetts, sits alone on an island, and beyond our borders there be dragons. But we all sit within, a context, a landscape, and this is just a shot of an important area for biodiversity at the junction of 4 different communities. And it's important to communicate across and sort of recognize how those natural resources flow beyond boundaries. So being aware of the context of your community while assessing those natural resources within it. It may be simple to say, or maybe obvious to say is the better way to put it. But different priorities that you prioritize, different values that you prioritize, will lead to different parcels that give you those values. So in other words, not every parcel of land provides the exact kind of value. So the types of soil, the types of vegetation, its landscape position, is it close to a stream or is it far from a stream? Is it wetland? Is it upland? Is it pitch pine? Is it spruce fir? All of those things, provide different benefits. And so the map on the left shows some priority areas if you're thinking about prime forest and farm soils. And those parcels of importance are different than the parcels on the right, which have been prioritized for biodiversity. And so one of the things that you'll need to think through is, what are our priorities with the community conversation? How do we meet our community's needs, and what are those priorities that we want to put forward? What's our sort of unique combination, and therefore what parcels would help provide that for the community in the long run? The kind of priorities that you place on the properties can also map to things like mission in an organization or the funding source. So for example, if it's prime soils, then maybe looking at working with the Department of Ag Resources and an APR program, or if it's public water supply, moving forward with water supply protection kinds of grant funding. So the priorities help you choose not only the parcel, which will be different based on the value, but also potentially partners and funding sources. So when we were putting this webinar together, we recognized that there are a lot of tools out there, and we just weren't sure which way to take this, because we could spend a lot of time going through each of these tools that can be used for prioritizing land in your community. And some of them, they sort of operate at a range of proficiency. So some of them are very straightforward. You can take the biomap and place that on your town and just sort of know a parcel's in or out. Some of them, like mass caps, require sort of a higher technical level of knowledge and can be, very useful, but, depending on your expertise within the community, that may or may not be the right tool for you. So I guess what seem to make the most sense is to communicate to you that there are a number of tools that can be used, GIS based software and programs that can be used to help you prioritize your land. Much of it is focused on wildlife and resiliency. And I am pleased to say that our friends Scott Jackson and Melissa O'Connor and Lee Hallis at UMass, recognizing that there are a lot of these tools out there and that it could get quite confusing for people like me or you working in a community, they developed a page and a tool called the Land Conservation Tools. And I have the web address at the bottom, but you can go and actually see each of these tools and see a description about what each of these tools does. And there's actually even this neat little sorting function. So you can sort of hit a drop-down menu and it will help you sort out some of the tools that might be best for your use. The other thing they did, which I think was genius, is on the right-hand side. I'm showing an image of a cheat sheet. I think they actually call it that, a cheat sheet that just sort of very quickly tells you a little bit about each tool, and maybe you can sort out what your needs might be or what the most appropriate tool for you is. And so I would encourage you to look at that site, use the cheat sheet if you're interested. Of course, one of the things I would highly encourage you to consider is considering a range of ecological values and social values. But on this slide, ecological values, recognize that that a diverse set of values will oftentimes draw in a diverse set of stakeholders. So if we're solely focused in on sort of on wildlife and birds, and how to protect that habitat, oftentimes what will attract are people that are really interested in wildlife and birds, and that can be good. But we want to diversify. We want, more people under the tent of land conservation, and that means diversifying our interests to get to different segments that so they too can see the value of the work that you do in land conservation in general. You can engage new people. Diversifying your goals can also access new funding sources. I don't want to forget, the huge importance of social diversity. This has been something that we as a land conservation community have not been good at. And so thinking through how land protection can help your community in many different ways, not just wildlife, but many different ways to meet the needs of the whole community, not just sort of the one segment of the community. So I would encourage you to work that into your goal setting by reaching out to diverse communities within your towns, and also finding ways, to prioritize land that helps meet this objective. And I just want to put a plug in on the February 10th webinar is going to be on social context in your community, and they'll be talking more in detail more about this. So I couldn't resist showing a couple of slides here in regard to the mapping piece of this. So I chose Mapper, which is a product of Mass Audubon. So thank you, Mass Audubon. And one of the reasons I chose it is because it's straightforward. It offers some amount of flexibility, but it's very intuitive, I think, and very easy to use. So you can go to the tool and you can actually check on things that are your most sort of your highest priority, or maybe they're combinations of priorities, and you can run the model for your extent, for your scale. So in this particular case, I did Chesterfield because that's where I happen to live, and I checked the following boxes. One of the other things I like about the Mapper is not only is it easy to use for someone like me that doesn't have any GIS experience, and it includes wildlife, but it also includes check boxes to prioritize underrepresented settings, like we just talked about, meeting that social diversity, public water supplies, both surface and wellhead, and also prime farmland. So it gets, gets us sort of out of just the wildlife box and helps us, diversify what we're looking at. So that's a great tool to consider. Julia mentioned the Oliver, what used to be Oliver, but now Mass Mapper. And that is a good, straightforward tool. You don't need any special software for either of these tools. You can just log on. It's web-based. And as Julia mentioned, we'll be doing some more of these mapper trainings. I think if we ran 10 of them a year, it would still be too few. We've had a really strong response about this. So that's great. We're working with somebody to do a series of these, and also looking at the possibility of developing just a quick PDF guide. So to give you a little guidance if you want to play with it on your own. The other thing I would mention to you is the importance of sharing your priorities. Take the opportunity, after you've had these community conversations, to reach out to, the Mass Wildlife and DCR land conservation folks. Reach out to your local land trust, statewide, regional, and local if you've got one in your community, and share with them your priorities. Develop a relationship. If things go, information goes both ways. You can access their expertise and information. And importantly, many projects require a partnership. It requires not just, the statewide folks or the local folks. Oftentimes, it's a combination of the expertise, resources, and time of larger organizations and agencies, in combination with, the relationships and support at the local level. So reaching out and sort of sharing your priorities and what direction you're heading in, and get to know those folks can be very powerful in and of itself. There are people and resources to help you. There, in addition to the 8 or 10 mapping tools that you have access to, there are additional tools, as Julia said, our Open Space Handbook. And so if you would like a hard copy of that, please email us or put your name into the chat, and we can mail you a hard copy of that, and get that out in the mail this week. Masswoods.org includes a web page for open space committees, and it has events, Open Space Handbook, grant opportunities. There are also resources about the financial impact, which I know a lot of people are interested in. And on Masswoods, and under the professional tool, you can find your local land trust, and you can also find the state agency land conservation specialist working in every community. So put in the name of your community, your town, your city, hit apply, and on the left-hand column will be those contacts in case you don't know them already. And just circling back, the regional conservation partnerships, great groups, great way to get involved, meet people, and help everybody pull in the same direction. They've got a very neat tool. You can go onto the website and find your local RCP. There's also a group called Academics for Land Protection in New England, a group of academics helping support local efforts. So I would encourage you to investigate that effort. And just a couple final thoughts. Don't get overwhelmed. I too often run into people that are very caring and that want to do land conservation in their community, but they stop short because they feel like, I don't know, they don't know the tax law, they don't know the intricacies of CRs, or they don't know, I don't know, or how to do a GIS map. Remember your role. There are people in your community that can help with those things. Focus on relationships. Make a pie and pot of coffee and talk to neighbors. Pull people together for a bonfire or a woods walk or something. Developing those relationships, having those in place, will help you with both the proactive and reactive forms of land conservation in your community. This is one of my favorite Aldo quotes that we put into the handbook, but I just can't overemphasize the important role that you play at that local level, that I think all too often we want to rely on a larger agency or program, and the reality is success will largely be dictated by what happens on the local level, which is why you're so important. So thank you for your time. I'm going to stop sharing, and Julia, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Paul. As I mentioned before, open space and recreation plans are a great way to gain a better understanding of the ecological components that are present in your community. However, there are also a number of other benefits to these plans, including making your community eligible to apply for several open space grants. I now will turn it over to Melissa Cryan, the Grants Program Supervisor at the Division of Conservation Services, who will talk further about open space and recreation plans. Take it away, Melissa.
Thanks, Julia. And not to then counter what Paul just said with that Aldo Leopold quote, but I am from the government, so hopefully it isn't going to be too bad. But can everybody see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Wonderful. So thanks so much for having me here. I miss the days when we could all meet in person, but I am very excited that we have as many people in this virtual room as we do, and it's far more than we were able to pack into one classroom at the community college. This is a really great opportunity to get to reach so many people all at one time. So I can't see the virtual hands being raised or not raised, but I will just throw out there, and you can raise your hand in your office or room or whatever space you're currently in. How many of you have written or are currently involved in writing an open space and recreation plan? I'm sure a lot of you are answering yes to that question, but for those of you who haven't been involved in one or want a refresher, what is an open space and recreation plan? It's pretty much as it sounds. It's a document that describes the community's open space and recreation resources, and we hope that it serves as a blueprint for action for open space and recreation decision makers in your community. And those decision makers come from all sorts of different places. Those are members of your Concom, your Parks Commission, your CPC committee, your planning board, but also local citizens. And what is open space? I think we all kind of have a sense as to what that is: conservation land, forest land, ag land, parks, green spaces around our cities and towns. But we at the division like to have a much broader definition of open space. Please think about looking at the undeveloped land in your communities and focus on those vacant lots and brownfields that you could redevelop into recreation areas, maybe even some community gardens. And most of the open space in your community is owned by an agency or organization that's dedicated to conservation or recreation. But please keep in mind that not all open space is protected. And part of the benefit of doing an OSRP is to discover which of these properties are not currently protected open space. Why would you even bother going through all of the headache of writing an open space recreation plan? Well, first, it can help to integrate all of the sources of data into one space. It helps to educate the people who are living in your community about conservation and recreation issues, and helps to increase awareness of these topics, so that if you're thinking about needing to pass a town meeting vote on to the acquisition of a conservation land, if you've gone through an OSRP process, then it's not coming out of the blue to the community members. They hopefully will help pass that sort of vote at your local town meeting. It also helps to identify actions that will protect and manage your community's resources. But also, as Julia mentioned, we're not so dumb at the division to think that you're not just going to plan for planning's sake, even though I am a planner. So I think it is worth doing it just for that purpose, but also it does help to make you eligible for many of the grant programs that we offer at DCS. So there is a carrot at the end of that stick. What are the OSRP requirements? We do have a workbook on our website. Don't worry about scribbling down that very wonky link. You can just Google Open Space and Recreation Planners Workbook and you will find it there. There are 9 sections of the OSRP, and the highlights of which are both the inventory of your open space as well as the action plan. And I'm going to be getting into some of those later in this PowerPoint. So you made that big decision. You do want to write an OSRP. So how do you even start? So the first step is starting the formation of your committee. The members can come from all sorts of different places, interested citizens, as Paul said earlier, don't feel like you don't have expertise that would be of value. Everybody with an interest in this topic would be of you should join. Their local boards and municipal employees. The lead author of the plan can be a volunteer, can be a municipal employee, can be a grad student. In some cases, it's a consultant, but I want to give you some, make you feel better in that the vast majority of plans are not written by consultants. I think a lot of people get very sad when they're like, my town isn't going to spend any money on this plan. Don't worry, most plans are not written by a consultant. Most plans are written on a shoestring budget with volunteers and oftentimes with the guidance of a municipal employee. So often the plan is divvied up by what your area of expertise is. And but we would like to think that everybody should be helping out with the public participation process, which we look at as the most important part of the planning process and is also the most time consuming, so should be shared amongst all members of the team. So speaking of which, what is that public participation process? So the point of the plan is to identify what it is that your community is looking for when it comes to open space and recreation amenities. So of course, it's not just what you guys on your team are looking for, or the Board of Selectmen or the mayor, what it is that you guys want. It's what the members of your community are looking for. So you need to solicit feedback from your community's residents, and that process can take shape in many different ways: surveys, public meetings, you can have a public workshop, you can go out to the parks and trails in your community and just talk to people who are visiting those sites. You know your community best. We don't say it has to look a certain way, that process. You tell us what makes sense in your community. I want to reference environmental justice. I'm not going to get into extreme detail given my time frame that I have to talk here, but we are at EEA very interested in making sure that the environmental, easy for me to say, burdens that have been unduly placed on low income and areas of communities of color across the state, that we are giving them environmental goods after they have so long suffered environmental bads. So how does that look when it comes to an OSRP? That means that we are asking you to go out and do enhanced outreach in your EJ neighborhoods. Please keep in mind that I think that EJ neighborhoods, many people think of these as our densely developed urban communities. That is not the case. If you go to the EJ data viewer, which has been newly updated with our 2020 census information, you will notice that there are a lot of low income areas across the state that are not in our Springfields, our Worcesters, our Bostons. They are in very low dense, densely populated areas. So please don't just assume that I live not in a city, I don't have any EJ populations. I think you'd be pretty surprised to look at those statewide maps. Speaking of maps, wow, I did my own transition very nicely there. Good job, Melissa. So there are 9 required maps which are listed here. So just keep that in mind. I'm not going to belabor that point. A couple of other things to keep in mind that are required. We do require an open space inventory. So you have to look at all of your municipally owned conservation and recreation properties and list what amenities are currently there and what amenities could go there. So to kind of build on what it was we were talking about, your survey, what do people want? Okay, let's identify where those things could go. And then you have your action plan. This is also identifying some steps to implement the goals and objectives that you have, need to happen based on the survey that you had from you took of your residents. We also need you to do an ADA accessibility report. I'm not going to get into too much detail here. If you have questions, I'm happy to take that at the end of the presentations. But getting into what I was specifically asked to discuss here today, which is the ecological sections of the plan. So that is definitely highlighted in Chapter 4, the environmental inventory and analysis section of the plan. So Chapter 4 is the inventory of your community's natural and cultural resources, which would lead to identifying goals and objectives that will protect your community's ecological resources. So within Chapter 4, there is a vegetation section where there is an inventory of forests, where we ask you to discuss the recreational values in addition to biodiversity and ecosystem protection of your forests. This can also mean that you would be discussing any wetland vegetation as an important wildlife resource, and other unique natural resources such as barrier beaches, vernal pools, quaking bogs, etc. You also will identify any rare, threatened, or endangered plant species in your community. There is also a fisheries and wildlife section in Chapter 4, where we ask for you to include an inventory of species and habitats, as well as wildlife corridors that are in your community, as well as giving us, again, a list of rare, threatened, and endangered species. And you can, as Paul so helpfully listed, all of those mapping tools that Paul already talked about, those are great places to go when it comes to figuring out where to find all of this information that you could include in your plan. Scenic resources and unique environments is another section where you would be talking about the ecological resources in your community. Scenic landscapes, the DCR Scenic Landscape Inventory is a great resource for that. We also want you to discuss areas of critical environmental concern in your community, but while not all cities and towns have ACECs identified for them, you also should feel free to include areas that Biomap and Living Waters have identified as important resources in your community. And all of this information that I've talked about should lead towards which land is important for your community to protect, both from a conservation and recreation perspective. So I know all of this seems really kind of overwhelming probably now that I've listed all of the requirements of the plan. So you're thinking, who can I talk to for help? So we do include in the workbook a bunch of different resources where you can go to for each of the sections. But you could talk to different state agency as well as local and statewide nonprofits. But you can also ask me to come, whether it's come in person or virtual meetings, to come and talk to your open space and recreation plan committee about even just like, how do I even start? Or I've gotten going, what do we do next? Anything that you need, I'm happy to come and chat with your organization. And with that, here's my contact information. But again, if you don't want to write down this very long link, you can just Google the Division of Conservation Services and my information would come up. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it back over to Julia.
Thank you so much, Melissa. As a quick reminder, feel free to be typing in questions in the chat for the question and answer segment, which will be held after our next presentation. The Neighborhood Outreach Grant is an effort of the Conservation-Based Estate Planning Outreach Initiative, organized in partnership by UMass Amherst and Mount Graceland Conservation Trust, and funded through the Working Forest Initiative. The Neighborhood Outreach Grant provides funding to selected projects to implement neighborhood-based outreach to landowners on conservation-based estate planning. Cynthia, the Executive Director of the East Quabbin Land Trust, will be discussing how this grant is helping the East Quabbin Land Trust to protect resources and engage the Ware River community. Feel free to go ahead, Cynthia.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for having me today. I'm Cynthia Henshaw. I'm the Executive Director at the East Quabbin Land Trust. We're a small regional land trust that works east of the Quabbin Reservoir, focusing on 8 towns. And this is part of the area of the unceded lands of the Nipmuc peoples, many of whom still live in this region. So my role today is to provide an example of how one group, the East Quabbin Land Trust, is approaching landowner outreach through this small grant from the Neighborhood Outreach Grant Program. And so before getting too far, I want to be sure everybody knows that it's the grant is one that I would encourage everybody to think about participating in. It's a 2-page narrative request, so it's not complicated or daunting to fill out. So I think that's really important. It's not one of these great big long, federal grants. It's really intended for small groups and communities to be able to do some targeted outreach and work together, encouraging conservation. So what we did, the East Quabbin Land Trust applied for the grants, and we pulled together a small working team. There are 4 of us. We all come in with different skill sets and levels of experience in doing this work, but together. And we are focusing on the Ware River. The Ware River is, as you can see in the picture here, goes through 4 of the, and its tributaries go through 4 of the towns that we work in. So that was our ecological kind of lens that we took with us, partly because, and I'll get to why we've been doing some more work on the Ware River, but there's, cold water fisheries is one of those data layers that you can get on Mass Mapper to see where some high quality ecological landscape is. And we also do a lot of and want to conserve a lot of our high quality woodlands. So we've been focusing on or looking at protecting those resources, which is why when we got funded for this grant, came up with the title of The Woods and Watershed in Your Backyard. So what you're looking at here is both the front and the back side of the postcard that the initial mailer that we put together. And kind of what we're doing in this outreach is trying to hit landowners multiple times in multiple ways, so we have the best chance of engaging people. Because we know that land conservation is not a linear path, and there are many options for people to consider, many conversations, and it can take many years to accomplish. So the more times we can engage people in different ways, the more effective it will be. Okay, hold on. Why is it not going down? All right, maybe I did something wrong. Hang on. Let me reshare a different screen. Now is it going down? There we go. Sorry about that. So just briefly about the East Quabbin Land Trust. We actually began, the organization was started in 1994 after the town of Hardwick went through its open space and recreation planning process. So that was a kind of a real direct link between doing an open space plan and understanding that we needed to have a regional land trust who can do some of that land conservation work that's so important. And because our core mission is about conserving land, but we also recognize that people are part of the landscape. And so that we always try to seek ways to engage people, as many people as possible, in conserving the land, caring for it, and fostering a sense of community. So the story that ends up at the neighborhood outreach grant starts many years ago, partly with the acquisition of 3 miles of the Mass Central Rail Trail, or the former railroad bed that was and is now recreated into part of the Mass Central Rail Trail. And our organization, again, thinking about how we're engaging people in the landscape and caring for the lands that are out here, understood that not everybody wants to walk on a single track trail in the woods, hiking up and down over rocks and things. Sometimes people want to walk side by side with their friends or their partners, take the baby carriage, whatever, ride their bicycles. And the rail trail is a resource that we have in these communities. So we move forward with that kind of a conservation. We view this as a conservation effort because it does provide a safe way for people to be outdoors. This section of the rail trail, once it's fully built out, will have an opportunity to bike to school, which is great. And it also connects conservation lands. This section of the rail trail actually ends at the Ware River, kind of up here in this northern part of the section, the 3-mile section that we did purchase. So this is a map of that initial acquisition that we have. The green on here is the open space data layer. So you can see that there's open space in different places, and we always are working towards conserving additional pieces. But on the eastern edge, the picture on the upper right-hand side is the Wheelwright Pond Dam. And that is just upstream from where the railroad corridor did cross. That bridge is missing, but it's right there. And so we had the rail trail coming into Wheelwright. We were able to acquire another piece, 15-acre piece, and through that have continued conversations with other landowners in Wheelwright, one of which is the owner of this dam. And it was clear from lots of those discussions that the dam was not something that was needed anymore. The mill was not, it was put in for the paper mill function, which is no longer happening in Wheelwright. That building is used for other purposes at this point. So removing the dam would be helpful to the landowner, and we know the ecological connectivity would be improved if it was removed. And so the East Quabbin Land Trust began facilitating the work to get ready to remove the dam with the Mass Division of Ecological Restoration and the dam owner. Because doing that up and downstream are a number of cold water fisheries, this dam blocks the connectivity. And so that is a really important ecological resource that we were looking at. And just a side note, this I think is when it comes down, it will be the longest dam that has been removed. So it has real statewide significance. So the dam itself is this, black star kind of in the middle. The Ware River kind of comes down, what is that, northeast to southwest kind of direction. But you can see all the blue in there. Those are all the tributaries. Many of them are cold water fisheries. So, the work that we're looking at doing is kind of regional importance. So the green on this map is already protected land. The salmon color are the parcels where we are doing direct outreach, direct targeting through this neighborhood outreach grant. And those were parcels that were 15 acres or more with direct adjacency to one of the tributaries or the main stream. Let's see. One of the things that, so we did have, because we have assistance with the Division of Ecological Restoration, she used the GIS system to do this analysis and do this kind of work. And the data layers that were kind of principal data layers in here was the open space, the hydrology layers, the roads, and then the subbasin. You can see the dash around the subbasin portion that we're focusing on. So let me get into the specifics of what we're doing. So the basic marketing adage that I have always been told is that people need to see a message 7 times before it sinks in. I don't know if 7 is the correct number, but you need to see something more than once in order to actually absorb it, to be able to process and think through what you're doing. So we're using that basic principle in this neighborhood outreach program. We're doing direct mailings, targeting mailings to landowners. We're going to host several and those mailings will include information. We're hosting several in-person meetings where there's an opportunity to learn from professionals and their peers. And then also going to have an outdoor field trip so that people can see kind of management and action. So let me tell you a little bit more specifically so that you understand kind of some of the steps that we're doing. And I guess the other piece is that, as you know, I told you why we are focused on the Ware River and the tributaries that come with it. So we wanted to kind of focus all of the information targeted points around kind of the connection between water and our woods, and highlight things that we thought people would want to know about. So you've already seen our heads up postcard. So one of the things that Dave Kittredge and his students did a lot of survey work once upon a time, where they would send out a heads up postcard, then send the survey, then send a reminder, then send the survey again. So it's that, again, that multiple hit kind of thing. So that's what we're doing. We sent a heads up postcard. It had the dates, it had the main topic points on it. And then we are just getting ready to do a second wave of mailing. Again, this is to our targeted landowners, and we're going to be sending the Northern Woodlands magazine. It's a great resource for folks. If you haven't, if you don't know about it, I would encourage you to look into it. The Northern Woodlands folks have been doing a series of articles about the connection between forest and water. And so what you're looking at here on the screen, this is the infographic that they had done. It's information is written by Kevin Berend, and it's illustrated by Ravenmark. And in the spring of 2021 edition, they also included 2 other articles that made the connection between woods and water. So it was very appropriate. And you know, we can only do so many mailings, so we're just going to send this one edition. But we're getting ready to send that out right now. And then there'll be another mailer that we'll send out in March before our April workshop. And we're still kind of figuring out exactly what materials might be helpful. But I think having some of these in-person workshops, we'll hear their feedback and then be able to pick out some information to be able to send to folks. Again, trying to engage people in different ways. Not everybody wants to go in person, not everybody wants to read. So we're trying to do a variety of things. So we also have these 3 in-person sessions. So some of the key things to keep in mind, I've learned that you always have to have food and drink of some sort. And fortunately, Paul loves pie. So he does allow the grant to cover food. Sometimes you get grants and you're not allowed to spend it on food, but this I think is actually encouraged to spend it on food, because it is so important to have people, have people be able to eat while they're there. It calms you down. It gives you a different way to interact and engage with people. We have them set up for a 2-hour session. It's roughly broken up into, about half an hour for arrival and kind of eating some food, then, 30 to 40 minute presentations. We will also have kind of a 10-minute like supplemental speaker, and then also plenty of time, 30 minutes or so, for questions and answers. And the topics that we are highlighting for this, again, pulling in the theme between our forests and water, the woods and water, is connections between the woods and cold water fisheries. So we have a cold water fisheries specialist coming. The biodiversity importance of old growth forests and forest health discussion, especially thinking about hemlock and white ash trees, which are in being two of the species that are threatened right now. The revitalization impacts of river corridors by removing barriers, and also thinking about some of the funding options that we can accomplish, and ways that you can accomplish your goals with your woodlands. And then the field trip that we're going to have in April, that's where participants can, get right into a timber sale that happened last year. The forester, the service forester will be there. And in fact, the timber harvester will also be there to talk about how the wetlands and the water, the stream corridors were protected while the harvesting was happening, talking about the improvements to the tree quality and wildlife enhancements. So again, we're hoping that folks are interested in those particular topics. So that is what we have done for our neighborhood outreach grant. And this is an image from one of a prior landowner workshop. Again, this shows peer-to-peer learning. So the 2 people standing up are landowners who have done conservation work, and just very casual, sharing their story. Why did they do what they did? And that is part of our goal for doing this, is sitting around, having some good food, good conversation, learning a little bit, and really understanding why your land, that the people participating, your land is so important in this regional look at our landscape. So I guess one of the other things I would just say, I know you've heard a lot about the open space plan, but there's also master plans and municipal vulnerability plans that are happening. Many communities are doing. So kind of pulling those all together and pulling out some of the key points from those might be helpful in getting you started. And in our conversations that we had planning this, we also talked about kind of how you get started learning about the important ecological resources in your community. And for me, who I don't use GIS, but going on, I use the Mass Mapper, the next version of Oliver, to do kind of my mapping, to figure out kind of where the priorities are and how to move forward. And that's my contact information if you are interested in getting in touch with me. So I'll turn this back to Julia.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. So now we'll open it up to the question and answer segment. As a quick reminder, you can feel free to raise your hand and I'll call on you to unmute to ask a question out loud to our speakers, or you can type it in the chat. So I'll give everyone a moment to type in some questions or raise your hand. So a first question is to Cynthia. Doreen asked what magazine you're recommending that you're sending out to talk about the woods and water.
So I'm just recommending the Northern Woodlands magazine. And we're using this again, particularly because as we are thinking about how to make the connections between the forests and water, they had started a series in their magazine. So that's where they, the central spread of that magazine was that infographic that I had. And then they have another article about Chapman Brook, several pages with great pictures and good narrative that talk about the importance of our woods to our waters and watershed. And then they also have an article in this edition called Bringing Back the Brook Trout, the wild trout, which is also, we're thinking about and working on removing of a dam. So that seemed like a very appropriate article as well. But it's, it's a full magazine. They've got all kinds of other articles, helpful hints, great stuff. You could probably get it through the library or just look one up online to see if you like it. I have always enjoyed reading that. I'm sure there's plenty of other magazines and articles and things that would be helpful, but that's just the one that we're going to use for this particular grant outreach.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Cynthia. For Melissa, go ahead.
Julie, I just wanted to add to that. If people are interested, we've got a publication called Protecting Your Legacy that we have copies of. We'd be happy to give you copies of. A couple of communities across the state have done like a cover letter and then, put in the mailer the Protecting Your Legacy, which talks about making these decisions about your land as a landowner and has 10 or 12 case studies of landowners across the state who have made decisions about their land. So if it's helpful, we can get you free copies of that. And if that, again, and we have a publication on using your will to protect your land. So if either of those are helpful, let us know.
Fantastic. We have some more questions in the chat. Cynthia and Paul, do you have any tips for improving environmental connectivity for smaller communities with small parcels?
Cynthia's pausing. I guess the thing that comes to my mind is I don't know if the strategies are all that dissimilar. They just might happen at a different scale. In other words, I think the importance of relationships can't be overstated, which is why I love pie and coffee. And recognize, pulling people together, communicating the importance of the resource that they share or that they impact, and providing the opportunities for them to take action in a way that will affect that, and having people there. Cynthia's focus on peer-to-peer, we have found through research and experience is huge. And when people need to make a decision about their land, they talk to other people in the same situation. So if the wonderful photos she had of the two landowners standing up sharing their experience, you and I could say the exact same words, But if it's coming from someone like them, that's an unbiased, that's sort of sharing their experience, it matters. It's more effective. So I guess I would say I don't think the strategies are all that different, just at a different scale. Cynthia, what would you say?
Yeah, I would just add that, land conservation, my experience with land conservation is that it's one piece at a time, one parcel at a time. And when you, if you are able to do land conservation in a way where you're able to engage the broader community, it is a way to give the heads up to some of the other neighbors or other people that, oh, I didn't realize that my land actually might be valuable to conserve, and that there might be a way that I can do it, not have to, completely give up all the value that's in my land. There may be a way to find funding to do conservation. So parcel size doesn't matter. It's all in how it fits within kind of the landscape. And if you're in a more densely populated area, some of those smaller pieces are probably even more important and more vital to go for conservation purposes.
Yeah, and from a landscape perspective, having land that's conserved or is well stewarded across the gradient from urban to rural is really critical. I think, all too often, and I'm guilty of this, my mind immediately goes to the great wilderness or to, rural areas. But, particularly with that diversity piece and who are we impacting, and how many people are we impacting? You could, help with a pocket park that sees hundreds of people a day, many more than, a large parcel that may not get, a lot of traffic in a rural area. So there are real opportunities. I think investigating what opportunities there are, because it will be unique in your case.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Melissa, we have a question for you. What suggestions would you have for a post-acceptance / adoption of the open space plan in terms of keeping it a living document, focusing on priority items, and keeping the community engaged, especially to recognize the changes between rewrites of the plan?
I'm not quite sure about the changes between rewrites, but maybe I would suggest that you start implementing the low-hanging fruit, and also to I would say while doing the low-hanging fruit, while, as I said in my presentation, I think it's worth doing the plan to do the plan and planning, but also to take advantage of one of our grant programs, and then also to do something big while you're also doing something small. So to renovate a park, or to buy a conservation area, and so people see like, oh my gosh, all those meetings I went to were worth it. And so it's then that kind of builds the momentum. It makes people want to keep it going, and then in 7 years when the plan expires, start working on that next one.
Fantastic. Thank you, Melissa. Marion, you have your hand raised. If you'd like to unmute and ask your question out loud to our speakers, feel free to do so.
I will, yes. It's more a comment and a contribution to the last answer from Melissa, which was very good. I'm from Sherburne, Massachusetts. I'm on the Open Space Committee, wrote the Open Space and Recreation Plan, and now on Select Board. What we did when we put these plans together simultaneously with our master plan, so that their goals would be absolutely consistent, is we set out implementation tables that are really easy to follow and update. And what we've done in the interim is that the Open Space Committee decided not to sunset, but to be responsible for tracking implementation and letting the community know how we're doing. So we've been doing that. And just last month, for example, we presented to the Select Board and the town an update on where we've come in the last 3 years from the OSRP. And people were just amazed at, how much we've been able to get done. Of course, there's still a lot to do, but I think that sort of thing, it's just kind of publicizing the progress rather than, lamenting the lack of progress and celebrating the volunteers who've gotten the work done. So basically, that's what we've done.
That's a great idea, Marion. I think that nowadays, unfortunately, it's very easy to be negative, especially with the internet. And so I don't think that the good news gets out as easily as the bad news. So I think to promote yourself in that way, I think is extremely important.
I would just add, and I'm going to continue to kick this dead horse. You know, those are big landmark things, you know, doing your plan, and it takes a lot of energy, and it's you know, they're critical for understanding your natural resources, accessing funding, and so forth. But keep your eye on those relationships. You know, focusing in on your neighbors and you know, building relationships, building a network can really pay off over time. These decisions are infrequent that landowners are making. They come up suddenly. Oftentimes they're made without the benefit of, you know, the full understanding of their options and you know, who they can talk to. So, you know, simply focusing in on relationships, you know, a woods walk, you know, a bonfire, a snowshoe, you know, vernal pool walk, you know, whatever it is, you know, to create, you know, more relationships among many, you know, more landowners will pay off dividends as people need to make decisions. They know you're involved, they trust you, they had a good experience with you, and they call and say, my family's making this decision, who should I talk to? You could play a huge role in saying, gosh, you should call Mass Wildlife, or gosh, I know the person at the local land trust, you know, they're really good, you should call her. So even in between, you know, these really big, important, you know, plans and things, there's a lot of good things that you can do.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much for sharing. Joanna, you have your hand raised. You can feel free to unmute and share.
Good, thank you so much. And I'll try to figure out how to take my hand down afterwards. I'm a member of the South Hadley, Mass Planning Board. We're 17,000 member community. We are in the final stages of the planning board approving our master plan. And we've also been going through an open space plan that's not quite finalized either. Just last night, we had a conversation in a select board planning board meeting about two things: community surveys, and then how do we graph out kind of a matrix of what needs to be done and is it done, and you know, the feedback loops. I'll just make a comment because in reviewing the last couple of community surveys we did, they didn't really qualify as surveys. They had less than 2% community response. There were no demographic information collected, so we didn't know if all the 190 people who responded were actually paid town employees. We didn't know who was a renter versus an owner, age, anything. And I brought up the importance of using a firm, consultant, experts that know about building legitimate surveys and questionnaires, so you end up with data that's usable and trustable. And then the other thing is too, I asked a question. Again, I've got a lot of management background. I said, look, there are planning tools, and they range from pretty basic to sophisticated, something more than just a static Excel spreadsheet. And it was kind of surprising to me that 4 members of the select board and planning board jumped right in and said, we have no money to spend. We can't afford to throw money at doing surveys or buying applications to manage our project. And I was kind of stunned. And it just showed me that a lot of people on our committees don't necessarily have background in any kind of project management. So Marion, you mentioned from Sherburne that you would set up implementation tables. I would really love to find out best practices in towns for survey questionnaires and also for implementation tables and tracking and feedback loops for changes, because I don't think we should all have to invent the wheel.
Well,
and I'd be happy to just put my contact information I think it's still restricted though to just talking to the leaders, but I would love people to contact me directly. So let's see if I can put my contact information in. If it's open, everyone, great. So I'll do that. But any quick feedback?
I would just,
Oh, go
oh,
ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Marion.
Well, she sort of asked me, so I will tell you what we did. We have implementation tables, sorry, that reflect sort of the detailed outline format that we have in the master plan. So basically, they were done in a Word format. They're not Excel. They're just they're really good looking though, and they're color coded, so it's easy for people to look at them and use them. What else did you ask? I forget.
Well, I was also asking if people had experience in designing good questionnaires and surveys for the community, rather than just doing it very informally without any expertise on the part of people who do it.
All right, I'll pass that off to someone else.
Can I just say that at least from the OSRP perspective, that the action plan, we suggest that it's written in a table format. So that to me is easy to add just another column to say, you know, when something is implemented or your status, your update, that sort of thing. I don't think it needs to be much fancier than that, just to keep things easy for, especially if it's a volunteer board that's implementing the plan. And when it comes to the idea of a survey, keep in mind that if you have CPA in your community, you can use CPA funding to work on your OSRP. So that should hopefully help in some cases. But I also just, while I totally hear exactly what it is that you're saying, I just would hesitate, and I wouldn't want to have people just be like, oh, we don't have the funding to do the perfect survey, so we're just not going to bother. So because I say that being the person who has to also do the statewide comprehensive outdoor recreation plan, which is essentially the OSRP for the entire state. And we do a fair amount of stuff just through SurveyMonkey, and just to get some feedback, even if we don't know that what we're getting is at all statistically relevant. So I also just want to throw that out there just as a thought.
I was just hoping to build on Joanna's excellent suggestion. And if anybody has examples of tables that they're using that they find effective, or surveys, and you're comfortable sending them to me, I would be happy to, and I just put my email in the chat, I would be happy to post those on Mass Woods on the open space webpage. And, you know, I think one of the things that we envision that page being, and the Mass Open Space website, you know, one of the things we envision is trying to be, you know, sort of a resource for open space committees. And I think Joanna's right. Why reinvent the wheel, excuse me. And if people are open to it, you know, I guess I assume if you send it to me that it's okay to post, unless it's explicitly said otherwise. But, you know, peer-to-peer, it would be wonderful to have some examples that others could build on or adapt for their own use. So if you're comfortable, send it to me, and we'll get it posted and send you an email back out that it's there.
And Paul, I'd love to also, I mean, I don't know if this is just too much work for you, but if people have just updated master plans, open space plans, or, you know, vulnerability plans, I don't know if there's a way for us to send the direct URL links to you, if there was a table where people could then just click and see different plans.
Sure. Yeah. If you send me sending me the link is easy. If you send me the document, then that way, if the link goes away, it'll still work. So whatever is easiest for you. You know, we probably wouldn't post 30 open space plans, but, you know, having a handful of different ones from different parts of the state, different community sizes, makes a ton of sense.
I can't tell you how excited I am to be a part of this today, and have an opportunity for us to talk. And I'm looking forward to the other sessions as well.
Thank you so much.
Our plans, both open space and master plans, are on our town website, sherburnmath.org. And I think most towns, you can find their plans pretty easily from their home webpage.
You would be surprised the number who don't post their OSRPs.
You're kidding. After all
Yeah.
that work.
I know, it's so weird. I completely agree.
So we have some other questions in the chat. Nancy asked, besides completing the open space and recreation plan, what are the roles for open space committees? Are these defined by each town? And a follow-up to that is, what is a master plan?
Yeah, I will just say that I get, in fact, I just got one the other day about like what MGL, Mass General Law, is it that tells me which community members have to be on my open space and recreation plan committee? There's no such thing. That I cannot tell you, you have to have on your committee this number of people from these, or no, it's all up to each community. I just always tell people the rule of thumb is just to make sure it's as broad as possible. And because I will tell you that I always know when the driving force is only conservation people or only recreation people, and you should make sure that it is broad. So open space, recreation, historic, planning, CPC, everybody, include everybody.
Yeah, it's a great opportunity to reach across, segments that we haven't reached through land conservation, that haven't been attracted, because frankly, we just may not be offering anything of interest. And we've got diverse communities, and reaching them. This seems like we'll chalk this up to, this is an opportunity, for you to create. And this is, one of the reasons we started getting more active with open space committees 5 or 10 years ago, because, you're all out there, you're all passionate, you're all doing good work, yet there's not a lot of form to what it is. And that's a positive, because it allows you to create it. But it feels like having at least some sort of network that you can share information or share questions, best practices, if you will, and some sort of identity, sort of helps move everybody along. And that's part of the reason why we did the handbook, to sort of just provide some sort of, not structure as much as maybe identity and information.
Fantastic. We probably have time for another question or two. Cynthia, how have you handled community outreach in the face of the pandemic? Are virtual meetings offered with the in-person, or maybe this is an issue? Would you like to talk a little bit more about that?
Sure, happy to. When the pandemic hit, of course, everybody pivoted to only online things. And then we started getting back together and doing, so we did a lot of outreach things outdoors, which we normally do anyway. So being outdoors feels much safer for folks. We did decide through the small committee, that levels of COVID would be low enough, we thought, at the end of February and through in March, that we could have some in-person meetings. And we're expecting maybe 20, 25 folks in the room, spread out in the Barry Senior Center, where there's space for over 50 people. So we thought that there would be enough space, even if we would be sharing food. So, right now we're hopeful that, landowners will come and attend. And I guess the other thought that we had was whether or not we should record these and have them available for viewing afterward. So one of the things that happened, when COVID hit, we were actually part of the North Quabbin Regional Landscape Partnership outreach, and we were doing a series of things, and we were supposed to have in-person sessions that couldn't happen because of COVID. And so what we did was we ended up interviewing those speakers and then posting those videos and sharing the links, doing things like that. And personally, the organization, again, at the beginning, we had planned on like a great big work day where you wanted to get 50 people out on one property all at the same time. Well, at the time before vaccines, we all thought it was just too scary. So we kind of broke that up into different parts. We made some take-home activities. We had people sign up for special work days so people didn't have to get together in tight quarters. I think we're at the stage where it needs to be a little bit of a combination of both. That's also why we hit people in different ways, why, sending the magazine, people can still learn something even if they aren't comfortable coming. and get engaged. And then we'll also have the field visit.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cynthia. So we only have a couple of minutes left, so we'll close off today's webinar. We'll make sure to keep note of all the questions in the chat that we didn't get to, so we can try to get those answered for you all. So again, thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. There is going to be a short evaluation that is posted in the chat. Please take a moment to fill that out, as we greatly appreciate your feedback on today's webinar and how we can improve it going forward. Don't forget to join us next Thursday for week 2 of the Open Space Conference, the social context of your community, increasing accessibility for all residents. We'll be joined by Dr. Nina Estrella Luna of Northeastern University and Star Luna Consulting, Lucas McDiarmid and Jackie Dias of Latino Outdoors Western Mass, as well as Marjorie Turner Hallman, author of Finding Easy Walks Wherever You Are. This week, we'll be examining inclusivity and accessibility in open spaces. Please join us for online networking. It starts at 1:35. It's on the same Zoom link, and it's a great way to get to meet other conference attendees, network, answer questions that we might have not been able to answer during today's webinar session. And lastly, be sure to follow us on social media to stay up to date with the Open Space Network. Thank you so much. We hope to see you briefly for our networking session. And if not, we hope you visit us next week for our week 2 webinar. Thank you, everybody.